All right, we might get started. We've got a fairly full schedule today. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Gail Black. I'm a partner here at Gadens in the Property and Construction Group. So on behalf of the team, I'd like to welcome you all here today. This is going to be a panel session today. So joining me will be Matthew Raven, a partner in the Property Construction Group as well, and Professor Sharon Christensen, our resident expert that attends from QUT once a week. So we're very lucky to have her come in and pass on her infinite knowledge. So you're all very welcome to ask questions today. We do have a roving mic. As you can see, it's pretty popular today, so we actually have people who are live streaming through the YouTube channel today. So if you can put your hand up if you have a question, and wait for the microphone to come to you, and just to make sure that everyone can hear. So we're going to be going through a number of different issues today. So we're having a look at what's been happening in 2019. There's been a number of case decisions that we're going to run through. Obviously there were some building defect issues that popped up in the last 12 months, and we're going to see how the governments are looking at that. The digital transformation of the property sector is certainly alive and well, and we'll be examining some of the things that are coming out of that. Foreign investors have had a few changes in legislation that have impacted them. And then lastly, we're going to have a look at the things that are on the radar for 2020. So we may as well get straight into it. And as I say, if you have a question, please don't hesitate to ask. So the property sector has certainly been impacted by the digital transformation, and that's something that's impacting on many types of transactions. Matthew, would you be able to run us through some of the things that you've been seeing in the last 12 months or so, and what I guess we're seeing on the horizon as well?
Sure, thanks, Al. So I'm sure all of you know, like in many areas of life and business, the property industry is partway through a major transformation in terms of use of digital technology to operate. If you like to use a politically current analogy, paper in property transactions is a little bit like coal. It's there at the moment. We don't know exactly when it's going to disappear, but I think everyone knows it's sort of on the way out. So. To some extent, we're clearly looking at end-to-end digitalisation of the property sale and purchase process. That is from e-contracts to e-settlements. So we'll just talk very briefly today about some of the things that have happened in the last 12 months and what we see moving forward in that space. So probably most of you have heard of this thing called PEXA. I'll just give you, it's been around for a few years now, but I thought I'd give you a very brief rundown of what it is and how it works. It's actually an electronic settlement program. It was first thought of by COAG, which is a meeting with all the state and federal governments back in 2010. They poured a lot of money into developing this as a national system for electronic settlements. And unlike a lot of other jurisdictions that have electronic lodgement functions, it also manages to do financial settlements. So PEXA, the company, was set up jointly by the states and the four large banks to set this process up. And it's subsequently been sold to private interests. Effectively, what it does, in very brief summary, and that's probably hard to see, but a buyer and seller appoint a solicitor to act for them, and they sign a client authorisation, which is a prescribed form, and it authorises the solicitor to sign documents electronically on their behalf and to disperse funds or move funds around. So basically how that works, the system is linked into the land registry. So if I was to start a transaction, each transaction is called a workspace. I go in and type in the title reference of the property to be transacted, and it would contact the titles office and pre-fill a lot of the information. So a lot, property description, registered owners, details, etc. would automatically be populated. You then fill out the screen, the buyer, the buyer and seller both have access to it as well as their banks. Fill out the screens with the normal information that you would see on a property transfer form in Form 24. Fill in financial information, so that's identifying where the money is coming from and where it's going to. Everyone signs digitally, so it's using your filter. It's like a USB, it's like a little key.
Digital certificate.
Digital certificate, thank you, which has a password attached to it. So everyone digitally signs, and the time comes for settlement. The system actually pre-checks with the land registry and the Office of State Revenue the stamp duty has been paid, and that there are no dealings that have been registered against the title, like a KW or a private transfer. At the time of settlement, the system locks, so you can't go in and start changing things. It then lodges the document, or takes the source, the funds from the source accounts into a reserve bank sort of special account. Once the documents are lodged, it then disperses the funds to the destination accounts, which have been nominated in the system. So in very simple terms, that's how e-conveyancing works. Effectively, what it does away with is walking to a place of settlement, handing over bank checks and transfer documents.
But it's not just being used for, it's also being used for mortgages and leases and mortgages and...
Yeah, so that's sort of financial transactions. It's being used a lot for paying refis and paying discharges. Okay, so this is an interesting slide because what it shows, Queensland's the blue line, which is if it was a patient, it wouldn't be looking too good. So the take-up of e-conveyancing in Queensland in terms of transfers only is very low. I think it's probably about 2 or 3% at the moment. You'll notice those other two, the purple lines, are both right up near 100%. That's New South Wales and Victoria. The big difference between them and us is their land registries have mandated the use of e-conveyancing. So for nearly all transactions, you must use e-conveyancing.
And you probably get some shows that number. Yeah.
Yeah, you can see which that. Well, interestingly, it starts to go up when they announce the date for mandating. People start to go to understand the system and all the start actually using it to see how it works. But you'll see very high take-up once it's mandated. So it's very cool. I'll talk a little bit about what might be outside the scope. Okay, so the significant things which happened in the last 12 months in terms of this e-conveyancing change. First of all, Queensland, there were changes to the Gadens Act which expanded the scope of PEXA. So PEXA first came into Queensland in 2017, I think.
2015. 2015.
15. Transfers.
Oh, no.
16, I think. On a trial basis. So the Office of State Revenue were very wary about transactions being done that somehow they would know about and that duty wasn't counted on. So basically they, under the Duties Act, have only permitted it to be used for closed conveyancing. So one of the big changes late last year in October was they expanded the scope of what can be done in e-conveyancing from a stamp duty perspective. So effectively now everything can be done from a stamp duty point of view in PEXA. There are, however, some things which the titles office can't handle, so they are sort of scope. They're all pretty unusual things. The main one we might be interested in is mortgage sales. But basically anything where you need to lodge supporting documents, because from the land registry point of view, PEXA is totally automated. So all gets signed and lodged digitally, and no people have to look at it, so the systems verify everything. So whenever you have to lodge supporting information, as in mortgage sale, where you need to put in a declaration saying that the owner was in default and the default is continuing, PEXA at the moment can't handle it, so it requires sort of human checking. So the other things that happened during the year in terms of e-conveyancing were the Land Title Act was amended to abolish paper certificates of title. So that's some people thought that was very sad, but in effect, I think in Queensland they were, it wasn't compulsory to have a certificate title for about the last 15 years, so I don't think there were actually that many floating around.
No, about 12% of transactions would have a transfer. Just sorry, at the top.
Of course, so if you had a paper certificate of title and you lodged were dealing with the property, it had to be returned every time to the land registry. If you didn't lodge it, you couldn't register your dealing. So that didn't work it doesn't work in an e-conveyancing environment. You always have to cancel your title before effecting any conveyance. So they've been done away with. And the second and probably more important thing that's sort of all stuck in there was that the legislature, the Land Title Act, now enables the government to make a regulation which mandates the use of electronic conveyance or e-conveyancing for particular transactions. So it does require regulation. There isn't a regulation yet. The registrar has not set a date to make a regulation, but she has quite clearly said that she sees the future of the land registry as digital. So I guess in our view, probably by the end of this year, or next to the latest, there'll be some mandating going on. Now what's happening with the other states is the mandate started with simple discharges of mortgage and then ramps up. So they're usually now 2 or 3 years. So if we had to guess, I think we'd say within 4 or 5 years, we'll be in the same boat as New South Wales and Victoria, South Australia, and nearly there too, I think. In terms of so PEXA was the company set up to operate all this, but the government didn't. So there's enabling legislation, which is national legislation, which legitimises all of this and makes something signed with a digital key equal to a transfer document with a wet signature on it. It does not talk about PEXA, it talks about ELMs or electronic lodgement networks, and it provides for competitors to be licensed to operate those. So a second operator has now been licensed in Queensland. It's known as Simply, which is a company which is part owned by the ASX, which obviously has a track record of this type of transaction, or the shares, not profit. And it's saying that it will be able to deliver full financial settlements sometime this year. So they're working their way through all the regulatory things that need to be done to do this. So with law societies, the Reserve Bank and so on. So this has created a few problems because no one, when they set up PEXA, really thought about having another operator in there. So wasn't created to talk to other systems. So the big issue that has arisen as a result of Simply's arrival is how one system might talk to each other, who would be liable if, for example, I entered data in Simply and it got misread by PEXA and as a result the money goes into the wrong space and so on. So South Australia and New South Wales have gone off on their own little adventure to try and look at a whole lot of different solutions as to how that might be dealt with. I think the latest is that it probably needs to be a legislative solution for it.
No.
So there are a lot of issues in terms of having those two systems to talk to each other. On the e-leasing front, so the registrar has said she's looking at allowing people to use PEXA to electronically sign and lodge leases. Again, no clear time frame for that. However, there were some amendments passed this year, which on the face of them wasn't exactly clear what they were for, but it was the Natural Resources and Other Legislation GDA 2020 Amendment Act, which was passed on the 20th of February. It introduced the concept of building lease plan. So it's in the section about lodging leases and sketch plans. An alternative is now a building lease plan, which is a plan which complies with the registrar's requirements. It's all very confusing, but the idea of that is there's capability within PEXA to upload a plan at the time of lodgement of the lease document. So I don't think that's too far away, and I expect probably sometime this year you'll be able to use it to watch leases. There's an interesting landmark, I don't know anything about surveying or whether we've got any surveys at the moment, but GDA 2020 means Geocentric Data Australia 2020, which has been adopted nationally as a standard measurement position. And that's apparently necessary because Australia's moved 1.8 metres northeast since 1994. I throw that in there.
Fun fact.
The tectonic plates are moving. So of course the other big thing is e-contracts. We've this year, so the ROQ, which co-brands with the Queensland Law Society, which Sharon and I on the property law committee of, which we do all the hard work, we do the drafting, and they have all the law. They've put their Real Works platform, which is where agents go to usually complete contracts. They've put links on that to DocuSign, so they can now issue contracts electronically. We're increasing it to be used by developers in off the plan sales. It's much easier than if you've got 400-page contracts with disclosure statements. It's much easier to send them electronically and get them signed using DocuSign with a digital signature. So that's certainly becoming much more common. And just a bit of a plug for Gadens. Our e-contract system for developers is probably about 2 months away. It's not currently out for penetration testing to make sure it's all secure, so watch this space. And Sharon is the recognised expert on use of e-contracts and e-signatures, so I'll let her say a few words.
Thanks, Matthew. So I think, as Matthew said, we're seeing a big transition toward electronic transactions and contracting in business. The law as well is following that transition a little slower. One interesting case from last year though, the Bendigo Bank and Pickard case, it looked at the validity of a loan and guarantee that was signed electronically by a company. Now, the case was in South Australia, but it actually looks at the Queensland Property Law Act in terms of the validity of a deed being signed electronically. Now, even though in the case the judge decides that it was not signed properly so as to be a valid deed, the case makes some important points in terms of the interaction of the Corporations Act, the Electronic Transactions Act and the Queensland Property Law Act. So just in terms to summarise, I guess, a little bit about where we are at following that particular case. The good news is that what you are dealing with is a land contract, that it can be signed electronically. Certainly from the perspective of an individual signing a contract, the courts have accepted a broad range of signatures. So they'll accept typed names on emails, they will accept uploaded facsimiles of signature, and also they accept more sophisticated signatures like DocuSign. Whether it is actually a binding contract signed electronically, though, is still subject to the usual rules that apply to paper contracts. Did you intend to sign that document and to be bound to it as a contract? So that aspect is still relevant. The unfortunate news is that deeds as signed by individuals cannot be signed electronically. So if you're looking to enter into something that doesn't have any consideration and therefore needs to be a deed, you still need to do that in paper in Queensland. So
some examples of that.
So guarantees are often signed as deeds, just in case there's no consideration, or option deeds. All of those things still need to be in paper. New South Wales has passed some legislation to allow electronic deeds in New South Wales. We're hoping to see some movement this year with the Queensland Property Law Act to also facilitate a movement toward electronic deeds, but I'll come back to that a bit later. In terms of companies, which is what the case really focused on, it's clear from the decision that a company can sign a document electronically, provided and also that you may now be able to sign it electronically and comply with the requirements of 127 of the Corps Act. So that's the section that says that if a company signs with 2 directors, then it's deemed to be validly signed, and the company cannot allege that the directors are not authorised. So it's an important section. To date, there's been some doubt about whether you can use that section if you're signing a document electronically by the 2 directors. What the case demonstrates is a willingness by the courts now to entertain the fact that you can sign electronically, provided, 1, the directors have been authorised to sign electronically. So if you've got a constitution that doesn't specifically allow electronic signing by officers of the company, you would need to specifically authorise them. 2, the directors really have to place their own signature personally on the document. So the problem in the case was that the directors had authorised another party to upload a facsimile of their signature onto the document. The court was not willing to accept that there was sufficient evidence to show that that was an authorised act so as to authenticate it as a loan and a guarantee. So the other issue, and final issue...
So just on that, Sharon,
yes.
So that's an important point. So the way around that, we think, is DocuSign has the ability to require an SMS code, so it's a bit like dual factor authentication. So when the person opens the document they're about to sign, it sends them a text message, an SMS with a 6-digit PIN number, and they have to type that in to sign.
So certainly that gives you evidence that the person who owned the signature actually puts the signature onto the document, and that
was authorised.
And that was the evidence that was missing in the case. And the other point raised by the case is the fact that for you to rely on 127, you have to actually, both directors have to sign the same document. And there was some doubt in the case law, and there's some doubt in the case as to whether in this particular instance they actually signed the same document. This wasn't using DocuSign, and I think if you use DocuSign, that aspect would be covered by reason of the fact that the document is signed, the same document is signed by each director, although at different times, each director signs the same document. So the other important point from the case is that there is a growing acceptance by judges that if you sign in accordance with 127, then you don't need to comply with the state requirements for a deed, in our case in the Property Law Act. So that if you could get to a point where you have validly signed electronically in accordance with that section, then you would have a valid electronic deed. And the Queensland law, or the law of any other state jurisdiction, would not apply. So it's an important case. It accepted that that would be the case, relying on a number of other cases also involving Bendigo Bank. So it is an important case to have a look at.
What about if you have wet signatures on, so if you're a company signing under section 127, you have wet signatures on 2 different pages where it's...
If you were signing a deed, that would not be acceptable to have it on 2 separate pages. In other words, you sign a page and another page and you've attached it to the document, would not be a valid execution of that deed either. So in terms of land transactions and the move to digital transactions, there's also been a growing concern by registries about fraud in cyberspace. And there have been a number of safeguards instituted. The primary safeguard that is impacting lawyers, mortgagees, real estate agents is the requirement for verification of identity. And Matthew is going to talk a little more about some of the new requirements, in particular for witnessing.
I'll just do this very quickly, just on the back side. But, so there are a few provisions already, and these are really, I think, all about the government or the land registry, if there is fraud, being able to look elsewhere rather than paying it out of the government's coffers. Real estate agents and auctioneers already have some duties under Section 19 of the Property Occupations Regulation to take reasonable steps to verify ownership of property. Similarly, mortgagees have for some time now had a duty to take reasonable steps to verify the identity of the person who's about to take a mortgage. Under e-conveyancing rules, subscribers who are lawyers using the system for clients have an obligation to take reasonable steps to verify the identity of the client. And then the other safeguard for the land registry is this Section 162. So effectively, there's always been an obligation, for quite a while there's been an obligation on a witness who's witnessing a signature on transfer, usually by the seller or transferor, to verify that that person is entitled. But has now been expanded a little. So effectively, there's now reference to the VO1 standard, which is terminology really from the e-conveyancing world. We're talking about witnessing on paper transfer now. So effectively that would mean for an Australian, usually that's going to mean getting a copy, face-to-face witnessing, getting their original passport and their original driver's licence. Where it's now being added to is you can't just say, oh, yes, I remember 15 years ago, that's what I did. You have to keep a record of that. So you have to keep that for at least 7 years. So it's really put the onus back on it's put a higher onus on witnesses to make sure they're doing the right thing and keeping a record of that. And that's really what the registrar is interested in.
So that's lawyers, JPs, Commission for Declarations, anyone who's able to witness.
Anyone who's able to witness a transfer.
Yeah.
And it's added some documentation in terms of proving that you're entitled to sign. So if you're a seller, proving that you actually own the property. So some connection of rates notice, order notice, and if you're a buyer, a copy of the contract of sale would also be required.
And also interesting, I'm not sure if others have found this problem, the New South Wales Guidebook for Justices of the Peace say don't witness documents from Queensland Land Registry. So we've had a few issues around people having trouble getting documents on you to say.
Alright, so the court's been pretty busy in 2019. The three cases that we've chosen weren't necessarily earth-shattering changes of law, but they are actually really good reminders of how things can unravel if things go a little bit wrong. So we're just going to run through those, and there's some little takeaway messages after the end of each of them. So the first one, Curtin and Kirk. As most of you would probably know, that if you're selling a property in Queensland and the property is on either the Contaminated Land Register or the Environmental Management Register, and in the case of leasing, also if the property is on the Contaminated Land Register, before a seller sells the property and before the buyer signs the contract, the seller has to give a disclosure statement to the buyer. And if they don't, the buyer has an entitlement to terminate the contract at any time after settlement, up to settlement, or if they've given early possession under that agreement, so whichever is the earlier. In this one, the Curtins bought a townhouse at Newstead off the plan in 2005 and settled in 2008. When they signed up the contract to purchase, they were given, as part of their big 400 pages of contract and disclosure, a disclosure statement that indicated that the parent property was on the Environmental Management Register. They were given notice that the plan had registered and calling for settlement. Their lawyer did searches at that time, and the new description of the Curtins property hadn't been put on the Environmental Management Register. They settled and happily moved in. A few months later, in May 2009, they signed up a contract to on-sell the property to the Kirks for $4.3 million. They didn't do an updated contaminated land search at the time, and what they weren't aware that between the plan registering and their lawyer doing the search and then entering into the contract of sale, The property details had been uploaded and onto the environmental management register, and there'd been a bit of a glitch in the state system, and that the new description of their property had been put on in those few months. So they weren't aware that the property was on the register now, so that they didn't do the search and didn't obviously give a disclosure statement to the Kirks when they entered into a contract of sale. That contract had a 12-month settlement period, and attached to the contract was a lease to the Kirks. So the Kirks were able to move in for 11 months of that contract period. They moved in, and somewhere late that year, early the next year, before settlement, the Kirks discovered that the property was on the environmental management register. They were a bit worried about what the impact might be on the value of the property. They spoke to their lawyer. The lawyer told them that they had a right to terminate. Not long after that, though, the buyers encountered some financial difficulty and stopped paying the rent on the property and stopped paying their outgoings. They listed the property for sale in April, so still a month before settlement, because they were intending to on-sell it. They also asked for an extension of the settlement time, which was refused by the seller. A week before settlement, the buyers, the Kirks, gave a notice purporting to terminate the contract on the basis that they hadn't received a notice under the Environmental Management Register back at the beginning when they signed up the contract. So they purported to terminate the contract. The sellers ultimately on-sold the property to someone else that had a $500,000 loss and obviously sued the buyer for the difference. So the sellers argued that the buyer didn't have a right to terminate on a couple of bases. They said that as soon as the buyers moved into the property under their lease, they ceased to have a right to terminate. So remember that the time to terminate is the earlier of settlement and the time they're given possession under the contract. The buyer tried to argue that the lease was a completely separate agreement and that was an irrelevancy. The judge disagreed with the buyer. So the lease had been attached to the contract, and they said you cannot separate those two things. So at the point in time when they moved in, they gave up the right to terminate. The second thing that was raised in the decision was that, by the seller, that the seller argued, was that the buyer had waived the right to terminate on the basis that they had done stuff that was contrary to their intention to terminate. They'd asked for an extension, they'd stayed in the property, they'd been told they had a right to terminate, so effectively they'd affirmed the contract and given up that right to terminate. And at the end of the day, the sellers were awarded $635,000 in damages, and the buyer paid a little price there.
So the first takeaway message is always do research whether you can terminate the land register.
Whether you're the seller or the buyer.
Whether you're the seller or the buyer. So if the buyer had not moved into early possession, the result of the case would have been very different. They would have had right to terminate because the seller had failed to give notice.
And I think another message there is don't take any steps or any actions that are going to be contrary to the path you want to follow. By having, put the property on the market, they clearly had sort of indicated an intention that they weren't trying to exit the contract and that they were effectively affirming the contract. So make sure you don't do anything or take any steps that you're later going to regret.
Yes.
Okay, the next decision we're going to have a look at is QM Properties and Bells Corp. QM Properties was buying the remaining portfolio of land from a smaller developer back in 2007. The owner of the two development companies didn't know each other, and as I understand it, met each other at the golf club on the day they started talking about the property portfolio. The 6 properties were going to be sold all in one line, so it was all or nothing deal. It became apparent that the seller had told a few porcupines about the condition of the property, where the property was at in the development approval process, what the yield was likely to be for the development, and unfortunately though, these representations didn't make their way into the contract. QM was only given 3 days to carry out some extensive due diligence, as I understand, on 6 properties, and they were given a very large bundle of information. As it turns out, the property was prone to flooding, had some power lines through it, was affected by a waterway which was going to impact on the yield. There was stuff missing from the bundle of documents, reports, etc., as I understand it. And the seller hadn't quite been as forthcoming as he should have been. Unfortunately, none of these deficiencies were either identified or at the very least didn't make their way into the contract as well. So QM refused to settle on one of those contracts, the one that these representations had been made about, and made a claim under the Trade Practices Act for misleading and deceptive conduct and false representations. And this dispute went on for over a decade, and the decision was ultimately appealed. So it was a fairly long-term discussion, and I would imagine quite costly. The judge did make some fairly uncomplimentary comments, I guess, about some of the statements that were made by different people involved in that transaction, but ultimately found that seller had made some representations that were false, and they had made the representations to try and induce QM properties to buy the property. So the decision, the judge did determine that there were definitely breaches of the Trade Practices Act. However, ultimately said that QM properties didn't rely on those representations. So some of the things that the judge looked at, and there was $2.9 million in damages awarded, and as I understand it, interest from 2007 was also payable. So I haven't done the maths on that, but it's not going to be a small sum. But some of the things that the judge looked at there was the level of sophistication between the seller and the buyer. So although the buyer had made some false representations, and it was deliberately done to entice the contract to be entered, the QM properties was considered far more sophisticated and had people who were qualified to examine that material, had done some DD, and at the end of the day, the decision was that there was no reliance on those representations.
And that, I would say, is a trend in cases. It's difficult to get a misleading and deceptive conduct case up. Judges have become very sceptical, and they look for objective evidence. And in this case, they weren't finding any evidence that this was actually something that was material to QM as well. There was no term in the contract. So if it's important, put it in the contract. Take notes of the conversation, because who can remember what you did 10 years ago? Some people can't remember what they did 10 minutes ago, but 10 years ago is a long time to remember. You need notes. And the other thing the case showed is that they also didn't conduct a proper due diligence. So again, that was objective evidence of the fact these things really weren't important, and we really didn't rely on what you said. When we're sort of using that now as our get out of jail free card, which I think a lot of judges do think some of these claims are turned into.
But I think they did also put some emphasis on the sophistication of the client. So if the sophistication levels had been different or reversed, I think there could have been a very different possible outcome. And the last case we run through is a leasing matter. So ACM Properties was the tenant of the property that was owned by Perpetual as trustee for a trust. The sitting tenant's lease was due to expire on 30 June last year. They had an option but didn't exercise it. They weren't looking to keep all of the area that they were currently leasing, and so the parties negotiated for quite some time during 2018 and into early 2019 a new lease. There was a series of offers that went backwards and forwards, but ultimately in March 2019, an offer to lease was exchanged. So the landlord's agent gave to the tenant a document that was described as an offer to lease, but it included statements that the offer is subject to formal approval of the landlord in its absolute discretion, and 2, execution of legal documentation by the landlord and the tenant. It did refer to the terms of the new lease being based on their existing lease. The make good obligations were expressed to be still to be mutually agreed. So we've all seen lots of letters like that circulating around. The letter of offer also included a statement that the proposal was not exclusive and that the landlord could continue to negotiate with other tenants to lease the property until the lease proposal was agreed by the parties. The tenant signed the letter of offer, sent it back to the agent. The agent signed then at the bottom of the letter of offer, which had the statement accepted for and on behalf of the landlord. So, a few days later, the landlord's lawyer sent to the tenant's lawyers a deed of variation of their existing lease. So it looked like they were going to try and negotiate rather than a new lease, but an extension and variation of the existing lease. The tenant never responded on those terms, so never commented. But what the parties did do was do some extensive negotiating backwards and forwards about a condition report and talking about what that make good clause was going to be. Sadly for the tenants, at the end of April, just 3 months before the lease term was about to expire, the landlord's agent sent a letter to them going, very sorry, the landlord signed up a lease with a third party, you need to be out. They did graciously give them an extra month, but said your lease is up at 30 June, we'll give you to the end of July if needed. Tenant not so happy about that and were looking to try and enforce that offer to lease and argued that that was a binding letter of offer and that it was a binding lease in place. They also tried to run an argument that there'd been some deceptive and unconscionable conduct, but that didn't get up in the decision. The judge found, so that first condition, that it was subject to formal approval of the landlord in its absolute discretion, was satisfied when the agent signed at the bottom of that letter saying signed for and on behalf of the landlord. So that was ticked off as the first condition having been satisfied. The second thing though, that the judge found that the parties still did not intend to create a legal binding document until the lease was signed. That's despite the fact that there was, the terms of the lease was going to, the existing lease was going to form the basis. The judge didn't put a lot of emphasis on the fact that that make good clause was still to be agreed, but did consider that it was a clear intention of the parties that they were not to be bound because of that statement in that wording, that they, neither party intended to be bound. So that was a hard lesson learned by the tenant, and obviously not a good result for them who had to go and find a new home in a very short period of time. So some of the messages out of that one, I guess.
Look very closely at those subject to clauses. The one that was drafted here was probably not as watertight as it could be. Normally, if you do not want a binding agreement to come into existence before you've signed all formal documentation, you should in effect have a term to that effect, but there is no binding agreement between the parties until you have signed. Would make it a lot clearer. But the other thing that comes from the case is that judges are influenced by the conduct of the parties despite the wording in the contract. They will look carefully at the subsequent conduct to determine whether you have actually entered into an agreement. So you still need to be careful, even if you use the right words, about how you then proceed to interact with, in this case, the tenant.
The judges all very much look at the facts of that case. So the words subject to are not always going to be the silver bullet that you look out for. So if this hadn't been a sitting tenant, it was a new tenant, if they'd let them in to the premises early, there's all sorts of steps and actions that they could have been taking that could have ended up with, again, a very different result. So. And I guess a message for any of the tenants, we're still seeing that a lot of the tenants are leaving it very late in the piece before they get their new deal signed up, whether they're moving into new premises or they're trying to renew their existing leases. So they need to be careful not to leave it too late in the piece like this tenant did and have to find a new home. We've also had a lot of legislative changes that happened in 2019. Quite a few of them had some practical implications for landowners. Matthew, do you want to talk us through some of those?
Sure. So this isn't really recent change, it dates back to 2017, but it came up in my private corporate meeting a couple of weeks ago, and I thought it was the time to remind it because the next critical date's getting really close. So you'll recall back in 2016, there was that whole house fire where a whole family was sort of killed, and then smoke alarms to go off. So essentially, it's a 10-year phasing in of new smoke alarm requirements. So for new builds or when you substantially renovate up to the 1st of January 2017, it applies. But it's also going to apply when you enter into a contract to sell or lease a residential dwelling from the 1st of January 2022, which is not that far away. So very briefly, the requirements are, whatever the application date is, smoke alarms must be photoelectric and they have to comply with that Australian standard. So you'll see advertised, they will have those Australian standards tick mark on them. And it must also contain an ionisation sensor, which is the one with that little horrible nuclear symbol on it. They have to always be less than 10 years old, so you need to replace them every 10 years. Not surprisingly, when you press the test button, they have to work. And importantly, they all have to be interconnected, so if one alarm goes off, all of the alarms have to go off. And they either need to be hardwired or have a non-removable battery with a 10-year life. There's also some requirements, I won't go into great detail, but there are new requirements which are quite different from the previous ones about where they have to be placed. So they need to be in each bedroom, and they need to be in the hallway connecting each bedroom to the rest of the house. They have to be on each story, so if there's a story without bedrooms, they have to be on a likely part of the exit. And there's a whole lot of other technical requirements which I won't go into. Interestingly, the obligations are being planned, so everyone's going to have to comply with these by 2027. So, yeah. So it's phasing in. The legislation doesn't say anything about what's corporate. The responsibility is on the owner. I am here with everything hardwired and connected back to the fire brigade, so I'm really not sure about how all that's going to work when I'm going to replacing those. So I'll have to go and speak to my corporate and work out what's happening.
Would you say you put 8 in?
Yes, I think my electrician went overboard. I've got about 8 on one level of the house. I think he even had it in the living room and in the dining room.
It's future-proofing you against future challenges.
Obviously.
Okay, Queensland obviously relies quite heavily on foreign investment, and we've obviously got a lot of big players in the marketplace who are classified as foreign. Matthew, can you start us through some of the little changes that have occurred that are going to impact on foreign investors in Queensland and national?
Okay, so in terms of there haven't really been any great changes. The main thing, well, bear in mind that the thresholds for buying commercial property have been indexed from 1 January, so they're the new thresholds now. So for most people, the threshold below which you don't require approval is $275 million. If it's those sensitive properties, so that's anything with least government in it, or other sensitive things like ports or airports and all those kind of things, which places that manufacture uranium or whatever they do with it, biosecurity type places, they have a lower threshold, that's $60 million. And then for agreement country investors, the new threshold is 1.192 billion, that should be, or a full stop. And then secondly, from January and February respectively, Hong Kong and Peru now additional free trade countries will have free trade agreements that come into effect, so they're now subject to that much higher threshold.
And we've also seen, so previously foreign residents who had a main residence in Australia were exempt from capital gains tax for that main residence. For those residents who bought after 9 May 2017, that CGT main residence exemption has been abolished or straight away. effective immediately. For those foreign residents who purchased prior to 9 May 2017, will only have until 30 June this year to be able to sell their property and still get the benefit of the CGT main residence exemption. There are some very, very limited exceptions to those arrangements, and they're around death, illness and divorce. So it's possible, I think, that we might see a bit of a flurry of activity in foreign residents selling their main residence. Now that's also important for anyone who's buying property. So as you might be aware that if you buy a property and it's over $750,000, you have to get a clearance certificate from the seller, so a CGT clearance certificate. If you don't get a clearance certificate, you need to retain 12.5% of the purchase price and pay it to the ATO. So it's a mechanism for the ATO to make sure that people aren't avoiding paying their CGT and nicking off back overseas. So if we do see this flurry of activity and you are buying properties, just a good reminder to make sure that you are getting those clearance certificates. That's not just residential property, that's all property. So commercial, industrial, you need to get those CGT clearance certificates if you're at that $750,000 mark. We're also going to have a guest appearance to talk about the impact of some of the taxes on foreigners. John Nicholas, who's a partner in the Property and Construction Group also. He's doing a presentation tomorrow here, but for the Property Council of Australia, and he's going to give us a bit of an update on the land tax foreign surcharge.
Thanks, Gail. It's a very quick update, unfortunately. We were hoping to be able to give you a lot more information, but the Queensland Government is still looking at the surcharge and some extra relief, and we're not quite there in terms of the finalised position. I think it was very well publicised last year that from 1 July 2019, a 2% surcharge was going to apply to foreign-owned property. The definition of what is foreign-owned is quite broad, and it goes so far as to apply to people related to foreign persons. So you can't be clever and have a relative obtain permanent residency here, put it in their name, and think it's all okay. It doesn't quite work like that, unfortunately, and that flows through to company and trust structures as well. The surcharge is 2%, so it can be quite significant. And if we're looking at significant overseas funds who are investing quite heavily into Australia, that 2% adds up quite quickly. Anecdotally, there are people telling us millions of dollars potentially that are being taken off the bottom line. In terms of the extra relief, as I said, government is in consultation with industry stakeholders at the moment. The Property Council of Australia is lobbying very heavily on what that will look like. The important thing to understand about the extra relief is it's provided for by way of a discretion delegated to the Commissioner of State Revenue. So what that means is what it looks like in its final form, which we should hopefully see in the next couple of weeks, may well change. It may well be abolished. We don't know. So I guess watch that space. In terms of what the government put forward to industry, it was very broad in the sense that, or vague is probably a better word. It talked about the entity being Australian-based. It talked about the entity complying with further requirements and other regulatory requirements, whether that's Corporations Act or literally paying its taxes in Queensland. And then it went on to talk about it conducting business in a way that contributes significantly to the Queensland economy. And that's really where a lot of discussion has occurred. What does that actually mean? And the other area of discussion has been around the fact that government's telling us that they've reflected the Victorian extra relief, which isn't entirely right. Victoria specifically refers, for example, to widely held trusts, wholesale property funds, listed corporations, listed funds, which are obviously a much bigger catch-all for the extra relief, which means less and less people are paying the surcharge. So the Property Council of Australia has lobbied for similar drafting to go into the extra relief here, but we're yet to see what the outcome of that is. Looking at it more practically, what does all of that mean? For the moment, assessments for the 2019-2020 financial year for entities that may be foreign owned have been withheld. We're about to run into our next assessments for 2020-2021. So quite possibly those foreign owned entities may well be getting two notices pretty close together, if not at the same time, which can have an impact on the cash flow and other financial impacts. Anecdotally, we are hearing that we've lost our competitive edge to the southern states. Certainly a lot of the bigger funds out of Asia are looking much more south of our borders because they feel that our regime perhaps is not as favourable as the southern states, which could be problematic in the next few years if that investment doesn't come. And likewise, of course, land tax is derived from valuations carried out by the state. We fully expect that a number of landowners will now start challenging their valuations with a bit more vigour. And then finally, the question I'm getting asked all the time at the moment is, can I recover the surcharge under the leases where land tax is recoverable? Land tax in Queensland is not recoverable from tenants who are regulated by the Retail Shop Leases Act, so that wipes out a lot of the shopping centre, especially shop tenants, major tenants in shopping centres, commercial office tenants, industrial tenants, may well be contributing to land tax, and whether or not they have to pay the surcharge will purely come down to the lease at the moment. There is nothing in the legislation that prevents a landowner from recovering that surcharge, but a lot of tenants, particularly those who have had experience down south, are now specifying in their lease they'll only pay land tax based on it being an Australian natural resident and single holding basis, so they're looking to limit what they're contributing under the lease as well. I'm also hearing anecdotally that a lot of landlords are looking at recasting their rent structures, so they're not so much adopting that net rental plus outgoings plus anymore. They're looking at semi-gross rentals or fully gross rentals, and they're essentially looking at having their rent reviews in such a way that there's some upside there for them to cover these increasing expenses. That's it from me.
Thanks, John.
That was well done. That's live streaming.
The next thing we're going to have a look at are building defects. So I'm sure everyone's seen the Opal Towers, Mascot buildings, and the events that occurred in some of those large resi buildings about 15, 18 months ago. What's going to come out of those? I think you two are both fellows of the Australian College of Strata Lawyers and attended a conference last week. Charity actually presented at that conference. Can you give us a bit of a snapshot of those?
A quick rundown. So obviously the sight of residents having to move out of their building because of catastrophic structural failure on Christmas Eve galvanises governments into action. So we've seen a flurry of inquiries around the country. State building ministers have a forum, and as part of this they commissioned a report called the Shergold-Weir report. Arising out of that and a few other inquiries that were undertaken, it was revealed that there are significant issues in the compliance with the National Construction Code, some significant issues around that understanding of what the code requires, conflicts of interest arising in terms of the building certification process, which has led to a number of flaws, or that certification process not working as well as it should. There's a lack of information available to regulators, so contracts are entered into, plans are drawn, inevitably they change, a lot of those changes are not properly documented. As a result of those changes and cost cutting, there are often changes made and it doesn't comply with the code, which is performance-based. So inquiries go through a range and highlight a range of these issues, and the recommendations centre around a number of high-level areas. One, education and training, which all the governments have agreed to look at in terms of all building professionals, changing or looking at modifications to the certification process, regulatory powers, they're looking at increasing the regulatory powers of the building commissioners around the country, the interaction between building regulators and fire regulators is highlighted as an issue, needing work in terms of who does what, and also making sure they're not inconsistent. And there's also some work that's been recommended around information, making information more readily available, not just to regulators, but also to building owners and buyers. So what have we seen so far last year in terms of Queensland looking at this? So we do have the Queensland Building Plan. Queensland moved very quickly to look at the non-conforming building products issues. So aluminium cladding, we've had an audit, we've gone through a staged process of private building owners identifying cladding, and I think we're into stage 3 of that now. Where they've also looked at the chain of responsibility for non-conforming building products, which was introduced in 2017-18, and as part of that, regulatory powers were increased. So anybody up the chain who provides a building product that doesn't comply with the rules will have some responsibility in terms of rectifying it, and there are some significant penalties. Other things that are being looked at, so the Queensland Building Plan does have a mention of expanding the statutory warranty scheme. It's currently not available to residential buildings or any building above 3 stories, which is causing a lot of problems, and as you can see from the examples that have got a lot of media attention, they're mainly over 3 stories. So there's a big push around the country to expand warranty schemes to residential buildings over 3 stories, and Queensland's got that on the radar. A statutory duty of care to be imposed for economic loss. So at common law, there is no duty of care owed by a builder to a subsequent owner for economic loss. And governments around the country are looking at remedying that. New South Wales has already introduced legislation, which is in bill form, which should be passed early this year, imposing a statutory duty of care on building professionals to the owner of the building originally, and to any subsequent owner for a period of 7 years it will apply. So they're extending the usual 6-year period to 7. Victoria already has a 10-year statutory limitation period. Queensland hasn't indicated as yet in the plan whether they're looking at extending that or not. A central building information portal is something that New South Wales is looking at, using technology to have all that documentation available to authorised individuals, as well as the concept, sort of like an asbestos plan, of having a building manual that is handed from owner to owner, and it contains all of the relevant documentation, this in relation to the building, the original construction, but also maintenance. So there's some of the things that are around the Building Ministers Forum they're looking at, and which you might see on the horizon in Queensland in the next few years.
I think there's quite a few other things that are on the state's radar. There are quite a lot of bills that have yet to be passed. Whether we'll see, or how many of those we'll see that are actually implemented, given that we'll have a state election in October this year, I think we'll just have to, that'll be a bit of a watching brief for all of us. Sharon, you've been involved for quite a few years now in doing a pretty broad review of the property laws in Queensland, and state governments that you've been contracting with the state government. I think some of them have started pulling out of those bigger pieces of legislation, so do you think some of those will come in sooner rather than later?
I'm hoping so. So the review looked at the Property Law Act and the Body Corporate and Community Management Act. We're already starting to see some of the reforms. So first item there about mortgagees exercising power of sale after a disclaimer was identified as a particular problem. So mortgagees of property where the mortgagor becomes bankrupt, the trustee in bankruptcy takes control of the property. During that time, the mortgagee can still sell and exercise their rights in relation to their security. If, though, the trustee disclaims the property, at that point, the property reverts to the ownership of the state, and there was great uncertainty about whether the mortgagee could continue the sale. Consequently, they were running off to the federal court at $50,000 pop to get a vesting order, and I think of all the cases I've looked at, of which there are quite a few, only in one case did the mortgagee not receive that vesting order. The other thing that was happening is the state had to keep going and responding to this. So the amendment to Section 84 makes it easier for a mortgagee to continue their sale process. It provides a mechanism for them to give notice to the state and continue without the need to go to the federal court and obtain a vesting order. So that's already in bill form. The changes to the Property Law Act, there are quite a few changes we recommended, which will probably look like a new act. Hopefully, maybe seeing some form of consultation draft about that prior to the election, have my fingers crossed. That involves certainly looking at creating some commercial certainty for electronic contracts, electronic deeds, looking at issues around enforceability of registered covenants, and the Body Corporate and Community Management Act. We've already seen new regulation modules that were put out for consultation at the end of last year, and they will have to be out in final form prior to the election because they run out. The current ones run out in September. And they involve a whole lot of changes in terms of the management and operation of schemes, and Matthew is just going to briefly outline those.
Can you comment first on seller disclosures?
Seller disclosure was also part of the review, and there's a separate group looking at potentially introducing seller disclosure into Queensland. Initially what was recommended was a light touch sort of staged process, just looking initially at trying to have a more coordinated seller disclosure regime based upon what already exists. So contaminated land, disclosure of title, disclosure of rates information, some basic information in a simple form that would be easy and cost effective to comply with. See how that goes and then move on from there. But the government is still thinking about that. But again, we'll see some movement, but probably not before the election.
And Matthew, Body Corporate?
Okay, so just in terms of the changes to the regulation modules, I've just picked out 6 of my favourite things, or things that might be of most interest to people. So first of all, I'd say that the changes aren't really substantial. They've taken on board a few issues which were discussed in some of Sharon's papers, most of the detail about those in the Act, so that maybe still to come. So the main things that have been dealt with, in terms of the quorum for Body Corporate meeting, unfortunately I didn't follow the recommendation as an owner of apartment investment building, where we only can scratch together 5 committee members, and those 5 people are the same ones that have to turn up to the general meeting every year, which is held just before Christmas, and then get told, oh, we don't have a quorum, but they'll have to come back in a week, which is usually like the 27th or 28th of December, which doesn't fill me with joy, to be honest. So that's the problem. You don't have a quorum, you have to reconvene in a week, so on when it turns up constitutes a quorum. So what they have done though is allow the Body Corporate by the ordinary resolution to reduce a quorum from 25% to 10%, which is not going to help my building, unfortunately, because 5 is not 10% of 250. So secondly, there's been some updated provisions to facilitate electronic voting and notices. So electronic voting there was already something there about it. I think the draftsman at the time only thought of electronic voting in terms of scanning and emailing in a completed voting paper. So there's obviously some much more sophisticated strata voting models out there now. So in most communities you can actually go online with a PIN number and vote that way. So it's expanding that to cover that kind of thing. And then notices, basically if you've provided an email address, then that can be used to provide most types of notices to you. They tinker a little bit with disclosure requirements, so there's now an express duty on, or a prohibition actually on committee members from receiving any benefits from a certain person providing services, which can include the on-site manager, unless that's been approved by the Body Corporate. And they've also extended some of the disclosure obligations so that brokers or intermediaries are required to disclose any benefit at the annual general meeting in terms of the insurance policies that are affected. Probably if your developers, the most interesting one will be the additional items which the original owner of the scheme is required to hand over the first annual general meeting, so there's been a few additions. Development approval, foreign activation plans have to be provided. You have to hand over any warranties, plant equipment or the building, any contracts for supply of utility services, any claims under insurance policies. The big one is a new obligation to hand over what's called a facilities management plan. That's going to be basically a document which explains how to maintain and prevent damage moving forward to basically all the plant equipment and all parts of the building which are the road corporate's responsibility. So that's that annual paper. Yeah, I think that was some feedback you got in your paper from the Property Council. So as a unit owner who knows nothing about maintaining a large building like this, that actually is a very helpful thing, because I actually have a few issues around our one corporate not having, not the one I'm on the committee, I will do a perfect job, but the other one that I'm involved with, not maintaining its recruitment properly, and it's costing an absolute arm and a leg. So I'm not sure. I guess part of the problem might be that we're the developers and to what extent they apply with it. So it really isn't quite entirely clear how much effort you have to put in these things. I guess there may be potentially, if you hand over a document which doesn't explain how to maintain a very important and expensive piece of equipment, could perhaps be sued if you're a developer who doesn't apply their obligations. For not providing that, but that's not expressly set out in legislation. And finally, a 5-year industry fund forecast is required to be handed out by developers, which again seems to be in this day and age where electricity seems to go up about 15% every year, and insurance doubles every year. Might be very, very difficult to do. Again, no real consequences for either wrong or I think the idea of that is probably just to highlight in most buildings, obviously, for the first year, there's a lot of stuff covered by statutory warranties, or so typically the levies in the first year are much lower. So I think there's some perception about their disclosure, which is given off the plan advisors a little accurate, because invariably your levies will go up 20-30% in the second year because of that. Very quickly, so there's a new proposal that at the second AGM there is a mandate that there be a motion considered on whether to defect assessment report. So you vote against it, but it's just like the auditor one. So you decide. It's just a reminder really that perhaps statutory warranty periods are about to run out, so you might want to go and get an expert to look over the building for defects which you might have claimed in respect of. And finally, anyone who is in a big body corporate, like Hope Island or Century Cable, although this act doesn't apply to them, so they're really bad examples. One of the problems is there's a maximum number of committee members of 7 at the moment, and there's quite a few resorts around which have 12 residential bodies corporate on them, up to 12. And so you have the overarching body corporate for the site, and you find out that some of the residential bodies corporate aren't represented on that overarching body corporate because there's 7 units, so they're increasing the number.
Okay, and the last piece of reform legislation we run through today is the Residential Tenancies Act. The state released a consultation regulatory impact statement in November last year, and from that they received responses from a lot of responses, and they've narrowed it down to 5 proposed reforms. The first one that's I was going to have a look at is the power of a landlord under residential tenancy to terminate a lease. Now, what they're doing is removing the right, what they're looking to do is remove the right for a landlord to terminate a tenancy arrangement even after the end of the fixed term. So if you have a 1-year lease run to your tenant, you're not going to be able to refuse to allow them to have a new lease unless you fall into some fairly limited grounds. So those grounds are the owner or the immediate family member is looking to move in, you're wanting to do significant renovations, the right rental property was sold and vacant possession is required, There's been a serious, significant breach by the tenant, and kindly look me there if you've got a squatter in your property. So you will be able to get your squatters out. So this is obviously, these haven't come in yet, but these are some of the criteria that they're looking at, narrowing the ability for a landlord to actually be able to prevent a tenant staying in there. Obviously, this is designed to allow tenants to be able to sort of stay on, establish a home there, and not be sort of under the threat, I guess, of losing the place that they live in at the whim of the landlord. I think there is going to be some concerns. I can see it being quite hard for a younger renter. If there's 5 people that have applied to lease a property and the younger ones have no experience whatsoever and doesn't have a rental history, they're going to find it very hard to get into the rental market. I think landlords will be really reluctant to give them a chance if there's a risk that they're not going to be able to get them out or get them out easily.
And in other overseas jurisdictions where they've introduced similar reforms, you've seen a drop in the long-term rental market and an increase in the Airbnb market. Those who stay in the rental market, the rent increases, and now I can see lots of grannies moving into houses or needing to move into houses to get rid of tenants. The final unintended consequence, I think, that maybe the government has completely thought through. So there is a lot of evidence in other jurisdictions to indicate there are going to be some of these flow-on effects to these changes.
They've also expanded the rights for tenants to terminate leases. Some of those are around, repair. If the property hasn't been kept in good repair and maintenance, if there's been some false or misleading statement given by a landlord to get there to entice the tenant in the first place, and or if there's been a death of one of the co-tenants. They're also looking to implement some minimum housing standards, so putting out a much more specific list of criteria for basically the property structure, things like making sure the property is not subject to water leaks, that it's structurally sound, plumbing standards, things around security of the property and pests, etc. But also ventilation, lighting and privacy. So if there's a need to put up some privacy screens to ensure that people can't see into bedrooms and bathrooms and those sorts of things. So landlords could be up for some more costs in making sure those properties are kept habitable, as they obviously should be kept habitable. But also imposing some specific requirements around things like cooking facilities and sinks. So some commentary I saw online from a residential tenancy sort of manager. They said that they have quite a few properties within their portfolio that they manage where tenants aren't actually looking for a cooktop because they're looking for an area. They live in an area where they eat out, that they don't want to do cooking, and so they might have a microwave and they have a sink, but they don't necessarily have a cooktop. Those sorts of things are going to be mandated potentially if the legislation comes through. They're doubling so at the current legislation allows a tenant to spend up to 2 weeks worth of rent in fixing something that needs to be fixed in an emergency. They're looking at doubling that to allow the tenant to get in and fix something that's broken. The third thing that they're looking to do is expand the rights of the tenants to do minor work. So you'll probably have seen that a lot of tenancy agreements will say you can't hang pictures on the wall, you can't do this, you can't do that. What they're doing is, minor works need to be reversible, but they're looking to allow the tenants the right to put in some of those sort of personalisation modifications, so things like and particularly around safety and security, so they need to put in extra locks, put in kiddie safety gates, put in grab rails in the toilets, those sorts of things. The landlord's going to have to get a QCAT order if they're going to refuse consent if it's around accessibility, safety and security. The property owners are going to have to establish reasonable grounds to say no if it's around personalisation, energy efficiency and communication services, so things like hanging of pictures, installing water efficient taps, cable TVs, those sorts of things. If they don't respond within 7 days, the landlord will be deemed to have said yes. So don't ignore your notices from your managers. There's going to be sort of examples of reasonable grounds that they can knock them back. The fourth area of reform that they're looking at is to allow pets in property. So a lot of people will currently have prohibitions on pets. They're looking at removing that right to unreasonably refuse a tenant's request to have a pet in the property. They can, the landlord may be able to require some additional criteria around that. They might require pest controls to be carried out before they move out, require there to be a pet bond paid, so that if the dog chews the corner post in the living room, they might have to pay up an extra bond to fix that. And they're not looking to remove the obligation, obviously, of the tenant to fix any damage that they've done, but it's just going to give, if it comes through, tenants a right to have that. And the last reform, which I don't think anyone would have any qualms with, is putting some greater flexibility, I guess, in domestic violence situations, so that if a person is subject to a domestic violence situation, that they're going to be able to exit and cap the liability that they would have with just 7 days notice. So that's one that I think will be certainly welcome reform. Do you have any other comments on those? No? Do we have any questions? I know we've covered a lot here today. Does anyone have any questions or comments even on stuff that we've raised? Put your hand up and Kay will come to you with the microphone. Yes.
Thank you. Matthew Buckley from ACORP. It's something that's come up across recently, and it's got to do with defects in specific aluminium cladding on a lot of the buildings going around, and I know that's something that's very topical at the moment. I've had asked of me the question, I understand every case is different, but I'm a hypothesis. You've got a tenant in the suburb or in the city that's got a 10,000 square metre lease, and they actually only need 5,000 metres now, which are a long-term lease up. The building has got aluminium cladding, and there's now issues around them getting insurance because of the cladding on the building. The building, therefore, potentially could be argued that it is no longer fit for purpose, and a tenant may be able to get out of a lease because of that. I'd love an answer.
You know, I'm thinking about the story we heard about the company that was trying to get out of space with Brexit.
Yes. Yes.
Well, they had to work all their workers back to.
So they can occupy the lease, and there's no warranty of quality or fitness for purpose by a landlord. So
But there's a requirement of the lease for landlord to have insurance in place, and a requirement for the tenant to have insurance, which may no longer be able to be obtained because of the ACP. I understand there's a big question here, but
so the case
it really impacts a lot of people.
talking about is similar in the sense of Brexit. This large company was trying to get out of their lease on the basis that because of Brexit they could no longer now occupy the building legally, and the court said no to that one as well. So, and I think there's some difficulty, but
Generally, a lease or a property contract don't get frustrated because of some sort of thinking like that. But as a recipient of the face of the earth before.
And it's generally tenants take them as is where it is as well, unless there's any warranties in there, which would seem pretty unlikely. I think they're, tenants struggle a bit to do that.
It is a problem.
No, it is. But in the likes of cladding, I guess people have to be very careful when they're now signing up leases and signing up contracts of sale to check where everyone is at in that process. Because if they've, I think we've got phase 3, there's still certainly a lot of buildings haven't been remediated, may not need to be remediated. So.
Would a landlord potentially be providing false and misleading conduct if they knew they had the cladding, they can't get insurance and still lease the building? Sorry, I'll go now.
Yeah. It should have been, that's what I said.
Have you had anyone that's rejected the insurance, or is it just more expensive?
I'm not talking about an actual example.
Yeah.
I've got a client who's in that scenario, and they threw it at me, and I went, oh mate, I think you're not sure.
usually it's a case of it's very expensive as opposed to not possible to insure, and that's where I think it'll hurt. Any other questions? I'll get from you. Go. Oh, and you will have a survey in your pack. So if you'd like to fill that in, Anita, we'd love to get some feedback. We're also always looking for seminar topics, so if there's something you would love to hear from us, let us know. We also will do a little bit of a pitch. Staff has just walked in the back of the room. So Stafford and his team have on the 3rd of March, there's a seminar that's going to be covering the new koala bushfires and vegetation clearing regulations. So if you want to come along to that one, let me know, or just shoot me an email. And then also on the 26th of March, there's a all-day, it's an all-day one, isn't it, Stafford? Yes. It's a whole day workshop which is going to be covering off on compliance and enforcement action. So if you're interested in coming along to that one, it'll have a focus on planning, environment, sort of breaches. Anything else out there you have to yell? No, I covered it. So if you're interested in that one, let us know. But otherwise, thank you so much for coming along, and